Hello everyone, welcome to this very first video on the fundamentals of drawing. My name is Vladi Nescu, and I've actually had quite a few students who have been constantly asking me to put together some videos on my own sort of drawing practice and the techniques that I use to essentially create a piece and what I did to get where I am now. So this is for them and for anyone else who may be interested in drawing or in art in general. All these techniques that we're going to talk about are interchangeable with sort of drawing on pencil and paper or Photoshop in this case. I'm really just using this for convenience, but everything that we're going to talk about here you can also do with pencil and paper if you're following along that way. So this is the very first video that I've done, so I apologize in advance if it's a little awkward and unrefined. Hopefully as time goes on I will get better at making these videos a little more professional, but in the meantime, you know, it is what it is. I'm probably not going to edit these too much. I'm just kind of gonna let the camera roll, the screen recorder. I'm gonna let it go, and hopefully it's not going to be too bad. I hope that you do end up learning something from it. I hope these are fun, and yeah. So if you have any questions, leave it in the comments. I'll try to address everything as we go along. But yeah, let's start with the basics. So when we talk about drawing, there's essentially two camps here. One is drawing from imagination. Right? Wow, I can't even spell today. So drawing from imagination, and the other one is drawing from a reference. So drawing from imagination means essentially, you know, what you'd imagine. You're pulling an image out right from your head, putting it on paper, and that's it. You're not using any sort of model in front of you. You're not looking at anything to get that idea. You're simply pulling it out, and that's probably the hardest way to draw, especially at the beginning, mostly because you do need a good understanding of what it is that you're drawing. So for example, if you're going to draw a person, let's say I'm drawing like a figure, and so I have to understand my anatomy. I have to have a decent understanding of proportions, and all these things are going to play into whether or not I can pull this image out. Like if I don't have any understanding of any of the stuff, this is going to be really difficult, and I'm going to end up coming up with, I mean, I don't even know, you might have like weird, you know, forms. I don't even know. I've spent so much time doing this that at this point, like, it's become natural. And I think that that's the key here, is that you, in order to be able to draw from imagination, you need mileage. So you need to just continuously be drawing the same subject matter over and over again in different positions and different styles, and eventually you create this mental repertoire that you draw from. And at that point, let's say you pick up a pencil and a paper, you can sort of, it's not that you're not using a reference, it's that all the references that you're using are essentially in your head. So you've got it in your mind that, like, oh yeah, I've drawn a person in this pose before, and I can draw from that experience and pull it out onto the paper. So on the other hand, we have drawing from a reference, and so this is where you have your model right in front of you, and sorry. Yeah, sorry. So this is where you have the model right in front of you, or whatever the thing is that you're trying to draw, whether it's a photo, whether it's a real-life object, whether it's a person, and this is much, much easier to do. And usually you start drawing from reference, and then you slowly transition into drawing from imagination. Now, that's not to say that you can't draw from imagination right from the get-go. It's just that if you want to be able to draw mechanically correct or mechanically well, then you need to have that reference in either in your head or in front of you. Because if you don't know what the muscle structures are for a person, let's say, then sure, you can try to make it up, but is it going to be correct? Probably not. Is that a big deal for you? I don't know. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. It really just depends on what you're trying to get out of it. So drawing from a reference, this is probably what we're going to focus on most today, or at least, sorry, in this video. But we will talk about drawing from imagination later on, probably in a different video, just because it does require some slightly more advanced techniques. But for now, let's focus on drawing from a reference. Oh, one more thing, drawing from a reference, so this is usually a starting point, but most artists, they're not either in one camp or the other. They're sort of in this sort of middle ground in between imagination and reference. And usually what that means is that you have an idea in your head of what you want to draw, and let's say you want to draw a soldier on a horse. Well, okay, maybe I have an idea of what a person looks like when they're riding a horse. So maybe there's something like this, and they're sort of riding, you know, and I know that there's a horse here somewhere, and I don't know. But I don't really know what a horse looks like per se. So I know that I'm going to want to do something kind of like this. Maybe the horse is here, maybe it's, you know, how they have like that one leg in the air. I have no idea. I haven't spent like any time drawing horses, so let's say I've got this, and I go, yeah, this looks kind of weird. Let me pull up a photo of a horse and maybe some armor or a guy sitting, and then I'm going to use those images as sort of inspiration for the poses or the details of my piece. And in this case, the piece itself is from your imagination, but the details of the pose and maybe the armor and the horse and all that stuff are from a reference. So you will find artists that mostly sort of play around in this camp here, but there are those, you know, super advanced artists who they can essentially do everything from imagination, and it's super impressive, and also kind of it's super difficult. I mean, even I have a hard time drawing everything from imagination. But let's focus on reference for now. So I'm just going to erase all this, and I've actually pulled up an image of, I don't know, this is just like a still life of some fruits and would this be like a picture, I guess? So when you're drawing from reference, and I guess when you're drawing from imagination as well, you're taking a few sort of steps that are always going to be there no matter what you're doing. And those steps are usually, for example, that you're always drawing loose to fine. We're always drawing large to small. All right, we're drawing general. General to specific. And for the most part, we're drawing light to dark. Now I'm going to put a little star beside this because technically this really applies mostly to pencil drawing. If you're doing oil painting or even some digital painting, you might not necessarily follow this. I know for oil painting, for example, we usually go from dark to light, and you add your highlights and your speculars at the very end, and you move from your shadows to your lights. But for the most part, let's focus on just the basic, you know, pencil drawing, which is going to be light to dark. So the reason we do this is because I always see students, like for example, if I'll have a student who's going to draw this, and then they'll start off and they'll be like, okay, well here's a grape, and then here's the other grape, and you see how they're starting off with the details, and then they'll start putting in, okay, well this is kind of what the edge of the beaker is, and then this is sort of where the handle is going to go, and then maybe the pear is here. But by the end, you're going to get this sort of weirdly proportioned thing that might not necessarily look all that correct. I mean, in this case, not too bad, but you're gonna have a really hard time, and unless you've spent years and years learning how to draw and refine those motor skills. I mean, even this, right? You can see here that this handle part looks really weird. It's wonky. It's kind of too compressed. So you're not going to really get the best results working this way. better way to do it is to really try and reduce your subject matter to its simplest forms. So what does that mean? Let's just create, for example, our canvas. So let's say I'm going to reproduce this here, okay? And I'm doing it mostly square because this is kind of a square canvas. And what's the first thing that we see? Well, I'm noticing that the canvas itself is being divided right along this line here, okay? So I'm going to try to put that in, and I go kind of, where is that? Well, if this is the midpoint here, I'll see if I can use a lighter color. Here's my midpoint, here's the top, here's the bottom. Okay, well, this line here is about, I don't know, 1, 2, 3, 4, let's say about a fifth, I don't know. About here on my image. Okay, so let's say there's going to be my table or whatever this is. And there's also the back of the table, which is a little bit higher up here. So let's say I'll add that in somewhere there. Okay, this doesn't have to be super exact because we can always adjust this as we go along. Now, next thing is going to be marking off our tops, okay, and the bottom of our object. So I know that I'm essentially setting my limits, okay? So my grapes, and actually I put this a little too high, right? So you can see that this canvas is a little bit taller. I'll actually see if I can lift that up just a little bit. There we go. Let's erase this line. So here's my canvas. Here's the bottom. My grapes, they're gonna come up to about here. So this is the top of my image. My pear is going to come out to about here, and my other grapes over here are going to come somewhere there. So I've essentially set the boundaries of my image. It's my starting point. Now what am I going to do? I'm not going to start going into any details or anything yet, and I'm going to start working super light. So notice how I'm using like a really light pink in this case to start drawing, and really what I'm looking at is I've got this shape here, okay? I've got another shape here. It's kind of like a rectangle, okay? I've got sort of this shape up here, maybe a little square here, and maybe this triangle here, okay? And then this grape. So I'm going to try and reproduce these really basic shapes in my image. And I'm always trying to keep in mind where these shapes are in relation to the canvas itself. So if you look at the pear, for example, the top of the pear is coming at about the midpoint of the canvas. So I know that my pear is going to come about here. Okay, so this is all really just composition, and what that means is that you're mapping things out within the stage, within the canvas. Okay, you're setting everything in the right place, you're making sure everything's the right size before we go into any sort of detail whatsoever. So this is where you want to be super loose and just be very tight with your placements. Sorry. So let's say this is sort of my pear, and it's going to be sort of this shape. And notice how I'm not doing any curves. I'm working in very geometric shapes using mostly straight lines at this point. Curves are a little more complex, and so you're going to want to make sure that all your positionings and your proportions are correct before you start adding curves, which are a form of detail in themselves. So this vase, this sort of pitcher, if I'm drawing a straight line from top down, that's it's a little like if this is the midway point of our canvas, this is slightly to the left of that. So if here's my midpoint, I go, oh well, here's my edge of the pitcher, so I know that it's going to come about here. And notice how when I drew it, this line here that comes down from the pear, this line of the edge of the pitcher intersects with that. And because I measured it out properly, look, automatically it lined itself up with the pear in the way that it's supposed to. So if you measure this stuff out, then you'll find that your image actually kind of draws itself by the end. And this is all just math at this point. It's purely mechanical. It doesn't require any talent or anything like that. Really, all you're doing is just measuring things out and placing things where you see them. So, sorry, I've got like this weird cough. let's see, this edge here, this is going to come to about 1/3. Okay, so let's say about, oh, come on, here. Sorry, Photoshop is being a little wonky. There we go. So here's my third mark, and then here I'm going to essentially have the edge of my beaker, or my pitcher. Now this does curve in slightly, so I am going to want to try and get that little bit of a curve. Now if you're having a hard time with exactly how much of an angle that's supposed to go to, well, you could always imagine this line continuing all the way up and seeing, okay, well, where would this line end up? It would actually be around here somewhere. And if this one's at a third mark, and this one's about an even spacing between this line and this line, so I go, oh, this, and then that's an even spacing. Now I can essentially draw a straight line from here to this point up here, and then now I've got that angle of my pitcher. Now where does the top go? Well, this is at about 1/3 from the top, maybe? Yeah, I'd say that's about right, about 1/3. So here's my top third, and it's going to come to about here. So now I have the limits of my milk pitcher, my cream pitcher, whatever this might be. I also have this little triangle that comes up here, and this is actually going to come above this line. So see how even I made the mistake here where I just started kind of adding it in. I didn't think about where I was going to place it, and I actually put it way too low. That the spout here actually comes up and above this line, okay, comes out and then back down here. And notice this little triangle that it creates in here. I'm actually looking for that triangle in here. Come on. There we go. So there's my spout. And again, I'm working super geometric still. Now let's do these grapes. So I'm going to try and fit in this sort of triangle shape that I've created. And now that I have this, I'm going to maybe start adding in, okay, here's sort of where one grape is going to go. One is going to be in this little triangle that's formed over here. One might be right here, okay, halfway in this triangle. Another one will be halfway between this line and this line, okay, right here. So if I put a midpoint line here, come on. So right here. Here's my next one. Between this line and this line, I get half a grape coming up here. And this last one, oh, no, it's not the last one. There's one more right in here. And then the last one kind of just peeking through over here. Okay, so there, there are top grapes. Now these ones down here, let's see, they're in this box here that's created between the top of the pear and our 1/3 line from the top. So the top of the pitcher. Midpoint of that, and then so in the 1/4 box, this is where we're essentially going to have that grape coming in. So that grape's going to be somewhere here. And for this, I did kind of use circles just because they're fairly small. But here's going to be my other one, and the last one is peeking over this line right here. So something like that. Then we do have this sort of stem coming through between these two grapes down this way. So this whole time I'm drawing just exactly what I'm seeing. I'm not trying to sort of imagine like, oh, this is what grapes look like and this is what a stem looks like. No, think of it just in terms of these lines and shapes. And then we'll start going into all that detail at the very end. Now this stem here, okay, not the stem, sorry, the handle of our pitcher. So it's going to come to about the midpoint of the roundest. So if you imagine that the pear is like a circle with like a little bit coming off of it. And so you see this one. Let me see if I can get a better color for this. So we have, here's the ball of the pear. and then we have this sort of little protrusion that comes off. Okay. Over here, we're going to have the same thing. So here's our ball of the pear. Here's our little sort of protrusion. And then in the middle of this ball, okay, this is where our handle is going to come for our pitcher. Now it's not going to go all the way to the top. It's going to actually stop about, just a little bit lower than that third line. Okay. Probably lining up with, doesn't line up perfectly with this grape, but it does give us a sense of where it should be. So this is actually a little bit high. Maybe I want to bring it a little lower. It doesn't matter too much in this case. When you're drawing still life or scenes of nature and things like that, you can get away with not being super precise. When it comes to drawing people, for example, or faces in particular, that's when you do have to be very exact, because even getting something a millimeter off is going to actually make a huge difference. Sorry, I had to have some coffee. So, where were we? So the handle. Once I have the layout for my handle, I'm going to look, okay, how thick is this handle? Well, if it's something like this, okay, in the original image, then I'm going to try and replicate that in my image here. Okay, something like that. Now, of course, this is curved, so I will have to eventually go in and curve that. But for now, it's a good starting point. It's a good reference for where to put those lines. Now we have the bottom of the pitcher. Now I, in here, of course, drew everything right on the actual image itself, like a fool. So I'm going to try and clean that up a little bit for you, just so that you can see. I'm going to use black. So this is the edge, the bottom of our pitcher. What I want to show you is that it does create this little triangle underneath here. And so we're not going to hide that base. Okay, we're actually going to try and get that little bit of a triangle underneath here. So this edge here, which I kind of lost, is going to peek out underneath here and then come around. And it's going to sit in between the back edge of the table and the front one. So somewhere here. Now, if I need to, I can always lower this edge just a little bit, the edge of the table. And in Photoshop, it's really easy to draw a straight line. You just hold Shift as you're drawing, and it will actually create a straight line for you. So we have this grape that sits here, and this is going to sit somewhere here. So this is going to be just sort of hugging the edge of our pitcher. And as you can see, I want to leave maybe the bottom is supposed to be right here, because we do get a little bit of the table still showing underneath, and the distance from the bottom of the grape to the top of, or to the bottom technically of the pitcher is very small. So I want to make sure that I'm getting that accurately. I don't want the grape to look like it's floating above the pitcher in any way. Now here we're going to have these sort of details that are going to come over here, more or less. Yep. And then here's where that stem is going to be. Finally, we have these grapes here on the side, which are going to be higher than this grape, so they're going to be somewhere up here. I'm going to try to get this sort of triangle over here. And I'm going to look. This grape here comes to the midway point between the edge of the pitcher and the edge of my canvas, and so I know the grapes are going to come to about here. At which point, one grape is kind of half of that, half, and then one sort of peeking behind. So let's put one grape here, one grape here, and one just peeking through the edge. And now, of course, we do have this sort of stem-like thing that kind of comes this way. Okay, so there's my drawing so far. Now, this is really rough, it's unrefined, but it gives me a good sense of the composition of the image, and I can step back and I can look at it and say, okay, does this look right? Does it look like it does in the actual reference? Does it make sense? Is anything wonky? And this is the best time to change anything because you've drawn really, really lightly. So in Photoshop, of course, you can always hit, undo, you can make a new layer, but if you're working in pencil, drawing super, super light is going to be your best friend in this case, because then you have the chance to actually erase anything that you don't like. So once I have the drawing the way that I like it, now I'm going to start going in and really refining those lines. So now I can actually zoom in a little bit and let's say, okay, I want to start really cleaning up some of these lines. Let me just do this on a different layer. And here you can actually drop the opacity of the layer itself. So I can make it really, really light and then start going over it like this. So I'm not going to do I don't know if I'll do the full drawing, just because I don't know if it's really necessary, but I'll give you an idea of what it could look like at the end, because once you have your line work all set in, then you can start essentially adding color, and we'll have to do an entire video on color theory as we go along. But for now, and this grape here, this bottom one, see mine, I feel like it's a little bit large, so I'm going to cut it down a little bit like that. So even for me, I'm constantly trying to like refine it as I go through. This grape here is only going to come to about there, like that. I noticed that there's a little bit of something in between, and this grape actually does peek over the edge. This is going to come here, and this is where I'm actually going to start adding in those curves that I see. Let's bring that down there. And now I have my handle, which is going to be somewhere like this. Now I apologize, like my line work here is really rough. I'm not that experienced with drawing with a tablet. Not only is this like a fairly old tablet, it's kind of like scratched up, and but I also don't really use it that much, so even I have quite a bit of practice to do with it, but for now you can get the sense of what I'm doing, hopefully anyway. There's my grape underneath, and voila. Okay, do the same thing with this pear. Let's round out those edges. Now I can't really see much that's going on here, mostly because I drew everything on this one layer, which is kind of the dangers of drawing digitally is, I mean, on paper, I never really have to think about what layer I'm doing everything on because it's all on one layer anyway. But here, I'm constantly forgetting to switch layers, and I end up drawing, for hours, not realizing at the end that, yeah, everything's done on one layer, and so now I have to either change it or live with it. But coming from a background of, for example, oil painting, I'm used to everything being on one layer, so changing it afterwards is not that big of a deal. But I know for some people, it's really, really tough to correct something once you've already put it on there. But I guess, I think it's important to try and not rely on the technology too much. I mean, technology does help you in a lot of ways, but don't let it become a crutch. Like, you should be able to do any sort of artwork in virtually any medium. The principles and techniques are more or less the same regardless. Okay, so let's add this line here. Again, holding shift to add. There we go. So there is my picture with some grapes and a pear. Now, of course, once I'm here, the next step is going to be to do this on another layer to show you, is going to be to start delineating where the shadows are going to go. So I'm also thinking the shadows as shapes in and of themselves. Okay, so here, let me see if I can open the new file, which is going to be this. Oh, no. File, open. So let's open that one again. There we go. So here's our image, nice and clean. We'll try not to draw on the base layer anymore. But you'll see the pear itself, we have the shadow coming through like this, and it comes up here, and then kind of comes around. And here we have highlight all around here. Okay. On the vase, like this is going to be a little tricky to sort of get in like this, because now we're just going to make a mess out of it. But for the bigger shadow areas, like here, I can say, okay, here's my shadow shape of the grapes. Here's this shadow shape. Here's this one. Okay. And I'm going to essentially do this for everything in the image so that once I actually start drawing or start coloring it, start shading it, whatever it might be, I'm going to have a good sense of where everything is supposed to go. You don't want to leave decisions to the last stage, because usually by that point you've already committed so much that it's very, very hard to make any sort of changes. So let's say that I'm happy with this as it is. This is yeah, let's say it's something like that. Okay, here's my grape. It's got like a little shadow underneath that as well. These also have shadows under here, and then it's got that sort of stem coming up, and this is going to be a highlight. Okay, so let's say I'm happy with this, and I go, okay, my shadows, I know where they're going to go. I know where all the objects in my image are going to go. Now what am I going to do? Well, in Photoshop here, it's really easy, because you can just essentially make a new layer, toss that underneath everything else, and then start, coloring it in. So let's say I'm just going to steal this color, and I'm just going to go, okay, let's say I want to knock that in there. Right, and of course, when you're painting, you can do this with, right over top, and then this will be like your base layer. And usually I'll do this before I start drawing, but really, I mean, it really just depends on how you wanna do it. So let's say in this case I'm just drawing with pencil. Okay, so I'm using black and white pencil, and I have my drawing laid out, and let's say I want to start shading it. Okay, well, when it comes to shading, so when it comes to shading, I'm going to again start from really, really light. So I'm going to get, for example, this light purple in here, and I'm going to start with a base sort of tone across the entire image. Okay, and actually let me do it on this layer here where I did this background shape. So let me just erase that. And you can essentially do this on paper as well. So usually I'll try to give it like a base tone if I'm going to give it a background. Sometimes you want to leave the background just white, which is fine as well. But I'll give it like a super, super light sort of gray tone. And then slowly I'm going to start going into those areas that are darker. I'm not going to overdo it. I'm not going to go in with solid black just yet. I'm just going to go in with a slightly darker color than what I had already in there. So let's say I have this, okay? Let's say I'm under here and under here, like that, okay? So far, so good. Now I'm gonna go even darker. And in this case, you're gonna do this with your different drawing pencils. So you're gonna go from your 4H, 2H, H, then 2B, 4B, 6B, whatever. And as you go along, you're slowly adding darkness to your image, slowly getting darker and darker, creating that 3D sort of effect. Now here, sure, maybe I don't like the way that this turned out a little bit. Luckily in Photoshop, I can always go back in and refine it. Or you can do this with, painting as well. But with pencil, you are going to have the liberty of being able to be much more refined as you're sketching, okay? You don't get the same feel as you do with a pencil when you're drawing digitally. So, I mean, I can sort of try to replicate how I would, sketch or how I would shade with a pencil, but it's not quite going to get the same feel. With Photoshop, you do draw everything in a very painterly style, so it's very difficult to get those really smooth, like pencil marks. So let's say something like that, and voila. Okay, so there's my drawing. Now, of course, you can see how there's actually like a gradient here, so maybe I'll want to go in and just really lightly start shading in here, right? So here I'm just going not as dark as the rest of it, just a little bit darker, okay? Just to give it that gradient and give it that sense of curvature. And again, this pear, I'm looking at it, it is a little bit darker than all the other things, so I am going to make sure that the pear is not as light as the picture itself. Like, this is supposed to be the lightest part of your image, so you want to make sure that you keep it that way within your picture. Now, you can also see that these lines here, they come from the shadow area towards the front, towards the highlight. So I'm going to start adding some of that stuff in, okay? Something like that. I'm just going to draw a line from the shadow, fading off towards the highlight area. What you can also do is you can draw the lines completely across, okay? Now I'm just doing this really rough, and then go in with your eraser, okay? And start knocking in some of those highlight areas, like that, and then maybe in here as well. Again, I'm doing this really, really rough just to give you a sense of what I'm doing. Of course, I'm going to spend, if I'm actually doing this drawing, properly, I'm going to spend, a nice long time refining this and making sure that everything is exactly the way I want it to be. So in this case, because, we're painting, I can add, and this is either using, light paint, using white in Photoshop, or using your eraser, if you're using pencil. So here we can start erasing out some of these areas for highlights. Okay, so I'm noticing here it's a little bit lighter as well. Up here, so these are okay, these are fairly light. Maybe I could have gone a little bit darker here for these shadows. Okay. Underneath here, most of this grape back here, most of this handle like that is going to be in shadow. Now it is going to have this little highlight at the top. And so this is where you take your eraser and start adding in your speculars. And what speculars are those areas of like pure white highlight. And so this is where the object is going to be directly reflecting the light source that you're actually observing, or the light source that's shining onto it. So like that, you can see a little specular right here. So I'm going to put pure white right there. Maybe a little bit right here just to make it a little shiny. Something here. And now here the speculars aren't as evident. I should have gone much darker with these grapes because comparatively this grape is very, very dark compared to everything else. But here I kind of left it the same tone as everything else. So if I find that that's the case, it's usually easier here because I can always make things darker. It's much more difficult to make objects lighter, but to darken them, no problem. I just go in, I shade over top of it, and I give it a darker tone. Okay. I'm going to take my shadows in a little bit more because those grapes are much darker. Okay, something like that, like that, like that. And I'm doing this really, really rough, just for demonstration and time purposes, but there we go. So I'm boosting my contrast, and this is really a really important thing to remember is that what we're looking at visually and what we enjoy seeing is contrast. So contrast being the difference in the lightest and the darkest areas. And it doesn't have to be just light and dark. Contrast of value is probably the most common way to use contrast, but you can have contrast of size, contrast of theme. There are so many different things, but usually we want a really good contrast of value, that being contrast between light and dark, because that's what's going to make your image pop off the stage. So come from the background. Now the bottom here, this is actually sort of dark as well. So I'm going to add that like that. Okay, so let's say, there we go. And now I can also take my eraser, huge, and sort of clean it up here. Now on paper, you don't have to really worry about this because you're just drawing within the limits of your page. But here, I'm going to just trim the edges so that it's nice and clean. Okay, so now let's say I want to go even darker into some of these shadows. Okay, I'm going to go in here. Right around here. Right, so I'm really going into my darkest darks now. So notice how we went from really, really light to like some mid-tones, slightly darker, and then now we're going in with our darkest darks and really helping the image pop out. So really get in there. I think one of these layers, there we go. It was that first sketch layer. I should have hidden it. On paper, you can always, if you have a kneadable eraser, you can always sort of roll it into like a snake shape and then roll that over your image, and that's just going to tone everything down. It's going to really lighten it up nicely. So here's this grape. I didn't even notice there's another one sort of behind it. So I can always just sort of add something in like that. Okay, this sort of shadow area like that. Again, and try not to overdo it with your darkest darks or your lightest lights. Okay, they're just supposed to be like accents. They're just supposed to be areas that'll help it pop off the page, but they can very easily overpower the entire image and make the whole thing kind of dark and muddy. So I'm gonna go in here. So this is what we call ambient exclusion. Okay, this is when you're going in and really just putting, maybe even some pure black in some areas. So I can go like super, super dark, and then just right in here where objects are sort of touching each other, right in there, maybe even right under here. And I'm being very, very, very sparse with this. I don't want to overdo it because, like I said, again, your darks can really overpower your image. So now I have this and I go, okay, I kind of like this. This works for me. Now I can go back in and knock in those highlights. So here's my, oh, see, that grape didn't have it. I assumed it did. All right, that was a mistake on my part. So this one's going to have a specular. That one has a specular. So does this one. Specular being, like I said, the reflection of the light source on the object. Here's one here. Maybe a touch on this one. Maybe a little bit on here. Where else? Right along this edge. I think I've still got another layer that's like, yeah, see. So of course here I did it in multiple layers. So everything's kind of broken up, but on your page it should look something like this, and you should be able to take the eraser over top of it. Or if you're doing this in paint, you can easily put white paint over top. If you're doing oil or acrylic. If you're doing watercolor, then that's where watercolor becomes really, really tricky because there's no way to make anything lighter. So once you've committed to putting something dark, that's kind of it. And maybe one here as well. Okay. Now I've also got this highlight right here. And this is why I usually tone the background as well, because if I didn't tone the background was purely white, I would not be able to get this highlight here. Okay. And maybe these little bits on the stems. So even here, right here, there's a little bit of a highlight here along the edge of, the stem of the grapes, like that. Okay, so that's all right. It's pretty good, I would say. for, you know, a 5-10 minute drawing. I don't even know how long this took, but it's a quick sketch. Again, this can be further and further refined. You can use a blending stump. Where is it on here? So here it's a mixer brush, but you can use a blending stump in, you know, if you're doing this on paper, and you can sort of soften all those edges, make it really nice and sort of smooth. Like I can go in like this and really clean this up. And then once I'm done this, I'm going to go over it again just to, you know, add some more detail into it. But I think you get the idea. So once again, just to sort of recap, we're going from light to dark. And we're going from our really general shapes to our specific, to our details, and never the other way around. So there you go. I hope this was informative. I hope you liked it. If you have any questions, if I didn't quite cover something in this video, please feel free to comment, let me know, and I'll see if I can sort of, you know, make corrections for future videos. Like I said, I mean, this is the very first video that I'm making, so I don't imagine that it's going to be perfect right off the bat. But, you know, I'm hopefully learning as much as you guys are. So thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and yeah, keep drawing. Really, it all comes down to mileage, right? The more you draw, the better you're going to get at this. If you find that it doesn't quite look right now, I mean, that's fine. You just have to ask yourself, right? Like, how often do you usually draw? And if the answer is not every single day, well, then, you know, that could be, you know, your main issue. So don't worry too much if it doesn't look like the way that you want it to right now. Over time, these skills will, you know, develop, and you will start getting the results you want. Yeah. So thanks for watching, and yeah, I guess I'll see you in the next video.